Welcome to the Horizon Audiofiles, a podcast of the Defense Horizon Journal. The Defense Horizon Journal is a professional and academic journal that features essays, reports, and analyses covering geopolitics and law, security and defense policy, peace and conflict studies, applied military science, as well as developments in weapons technology. For more information, go to www.tdhj.org.
Episode number 62. Nuclear Disarmament and Just Transitions to Climate-Compatible Societies. By Andrea Bartoli and Joshua Fisher. Concurrent Crises and Historic Cooperation. The world today is facing concurrent crises, many of which pose real and urgent existential threats to human security and the ecological integrity of the planet. Among these, a rapidly changing climate and intensification of interstate conflict, both symmetrical warfare and increased militarization and transactional foreign policies by some states threaten to destabilize geopolitical alliances and reshape social and economic realities the world over. This erosion of cooperation likewise challenges the possibility of just transitions to climate-compatible societies by diverting resources, political and economic capital, and trust away from agreed-upon frameworks for climate action like those ratified in the Paris Agreement. While these are distinct policy areas and sources of broader social concern, there is widespread academic and political recognition of the interconnections and interdependencies between conflict and environmental crises. Highlighting this, a large body of empirical work has been generated that shows the impact of climate change on national and human security. The impact of military operations alone, while difficult to accurately measure, has been estimated to account for significant levels of greenhouse gas (GHG) emissions, accounting for up to 5.5% globally. It is also well known that since the beginning of the nuclear age in 1945, long residence time radiological pollutants have been released into the world's atmospheric, terrestrial, aquatic, and subterranean systems through the production, testing, storage, and disposal of nuclear arms and their byproducts. In certain situations, this has lowered the resilience of the environmental systems that provide climate-regulating ecosystem services. In this sense, climate and the spectre of nuclear weapons are interconnected and inexorably, even if indirectly, linked. While the trends of climate change, geopolitical tensions, and outright violence, often among nuclear-armed states, have rapidly increased in recent years, the international responses to these trends have lacked consistency, coordination, and effectiveness. The world has oscillated between moves toward cooperation and collective action on one end, and isolationism, nationalism, and antagonism on the other. The international response to both the climate and security threats of the 21st century has been uncertain and paradoxical. The reduction of the USA-USSR confrontation of the late 1980s and the period of increased international cooperation during detent, not only significant geopolitical restructuring but also very relevant nuclear disarmament. Downward trends conflict across the decades since the end of the Cold War began to reverse in the mid-2010s. While the total number of nuclear armaments has declined substantially since their height in the late 20th century, and testing is no longer an issue as in the past, many nuclear actors are upgrading and modernizing their nuclear arsenals. It can be argued that the early achievements in climate action, like the ratification of the Paris Agreement, were built on the foundation of international cooperation throughout the 1980s to 2010s, and yet their arrival coincided with recent reversals in trends of international cooperation. The structures and the institutional frameworks through which the world can mobilize coordinated action were built just as the general geopolitical trend began to move in the direction of disharmony. It is unsurprising, therefore, that sticking points such as so-called loss and damage in climate negotiations have exerted inertia on much of the early good faith engagement and led to an uncertain path forward. Current institutions and processes lack the infrastructure of effective cooperation and reify asymmetries among states, thus highlighting the need for truly just transitions in the energy system and perceived justice in adaptation and mitigation action to advance policy and action again. In both the climate and the conflict contexts, the world has experienced rapid shifts in engagement, isolationism, rapprochement, and antagonism. In the current international and geopolitical context, learning from past successes in cooperation may seem improbable. However, there are important cases of successful cooperation across deep divides, like the case of nuclear disarmament between the US and USSR, Russia, that should inform policymaking and process design. Where trends in climate or conflict are themselves general patterns in the direction of changes in aggregated data, there is inherent uncertainty in what an observed trend means for the future, and yet, many events highlight the precarious and delicate state of our planet. The world is only a simple error, oversight, or strategic miscalculation away from catastrophe. On the environment side, for instance, failure to reduce global emissions contributed to 2024 being the first year during which mean global temperatures likely exceeded the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degrees Celsius warming threshold. Whether mean temperatures remain in excess of that threshold, for how long, and by how much remains to be determined. On the nuclear side, access to newly declassified documents demonstrates that between 1945 and today, there were hundreds of instances described as close calls, situations in which a nuclear conflict was avoided by chance and limited human decision jeopardized the integrity and security of one of the world's largest stockpiles of nuclear warheads. Simultaneously, escalation in armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine, between India and Pakistan, and between Israel and proxies of Iran in Yemen, Syria, and Lebanon, all raised the possibility of strategic miscalculation by nuclear-armed adversaries. While contemporary events have largely, unfortunately, omitted threats of nuclear deployment, escalation of violence among nuclear-armed adversaries carries inherent risks. Still, trends describe patterns in aggregate data observed over a finite period of time. Expand the time horizon, and the trend line changes. Underlying the peaks and valleys in the data are nuanced events that can be extrapolated to inform policy changes and alter the trajectory of the trend moving forward. A short period of observation on either climate or conflict shows real and intensifying deterioration in the resilience of our world systems. However, expanding the observation period reveals important instances of past cooperation and collaboration among enemies, such as the US and USSR, Russia, that were based on verified and verifiable scientific knowledge and produced mutual benefit and advanced common good. The establishment and successful implementation of the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer was a landmark example of this, where the international community addressed a scientifically complex, economically complicated, and technically difficult problem together to reduce emissions of certain deleterious chemical compounds, which in turn addressed a global issue and returned global benefits. Effective cooperation across adversarial lines. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the United States and Russia were able to decommission large portions of their nuclear arsenals successfully. That process was politically relevant but also economically successful and yielded positive environmental impacts in terms of decreased need for long-term waste storage, decreased demand for uranium, and increased supply of non-carbon-derived energy for U.S. consumption, reducing overall GHG emissions throughout the period of cooperation. The case presented in this contribution, titled in different ways as the HEU Deal, the Grand Uranium Bargain, or Megatons to Megawatts M2M, was the product of the historic Reagan and Gorbachev negotiations. One of the results of that season of cooperation between the United States of America and the Soviet Union, later the Russian Federation, was the sharp reduction in nuclear weapons. It was also the recognition that cooperation was not only possible but advantageous for the parties themselves. It has been calculated that after 1945, more than 130,000 nuclear weapons were built. At its peak, it was estimated that global stockpiles and deployments of nuclear arms totaled an estimated 70,000 atomic bombs in the 1980s. Today, the estimate is nearly 12,500. A significant part of the observed reduction is attributed not only to the political diplomatic agreement but also to the technical choices that led to the repurposing of enriched uranium, originally proposed for nuclear weapons, to produce electricity through civilian nuclear power plants. This was possible only through the adjustments that were made by adversaries to cooperation and coordination, which needed to be harmonized not only with security and political concerns but also with economic ones. A proposal for the conversion through the dilution of the highly enriched uranium, 90 to 98% for the weapons, 4 to 8% for electricity production, is attributed to Edoardo Amaldi and his team. A group of Italian scientists and technologists, Politecnico di Milano, Pisa, Luis, Lindsay, and Saldo, Enel, ENEA, prepared the feasibility study that was then presented jointly by Italy and the USSR as Edoardo Amaldi Project, At the 4th NPT Review Conference on the 31st of August 1990 and at the International Atomic Energy Agency 35th General Conference of the 19th of September 1991. The study was relevant because the conversion process would have achieved several significant results. Nuclear bombs would be completely deactivated and made unusable for tactical deployment. Radioactive material would be used through the standard life cycle for civil application and thus no longer dangerous, and a large volume of electricity would be produced for civilian use, with significant and positive economic and ecological impacts. Meanwhile, decades of scientific exchanges between American and Soviet experts created the conditions for new explorations, making possible experiments and cooperative agreements that were previously unthinkable. In an op-ed in the New York Times, Thomas Neff suggested conversion as the technical component of the Grand Uranium Bargain, by which valuable material can be processed for use in commercial nuclear power plants. This program was subsequently branded as Megatons to Megawatts. World producers of electricity through nuclear reactors showed interest, especially Japan with TEPCO and the US with Urenco. The project was presented in Paris in January 1992. In June 1992, at a conference in Rome, a meeting was held with Pope John Paul II, 3 ministers, and several Soviet senior generals. On June 16, 1992, President George H.W. Bush and Boris Yeltsin signed the agreement that made the project operational, leading to the dismantling of thousands of nuclear weapons and the production of significant amounts of electricity for civilian purposes. The project was positively evaluated by IAEA Directors General Hans Blix and Dr. Mohammed El-Baradei and closely followed and managed by American experts such as James Tamby, Tom Neff, Daniel B. Poneman, Jeffrey Hughes, and others. In a surprising and unexpected way, cooperative nuclear disarmament had a profoundly positive environmental impact. Electricity was produced that reduced demand for coal and reduced GHG emissions through the use of non-carbon-based energy. Unfortunately, despite this outcome, neither the economic nor the environmental impacts of nuclear disarmament and conversion to electricity have been studied systematically. Doing so could motivate nuclear countries to understand and consider new cycles of these programs and new avenues for both reducing risks from nuclear armaments and contributing to climate change mitigation. At a minimum, knowing more about the political, social, technical, and international architecture of such cases would contribute to shared scientific knowledge available to all, including independent actors such as international organizations, academic institutions, and civil society. Just transitions to climate-compatible societies will not occur without the active participation of different actors open to trust and verify. What is already known is that by converting 500 metric tons of highly enriched uranium to produce 7 billion megawatts of electricity, the M2M program accounted for 10% of U.S. electricity production or half of the energy generated by nuclear power in the U.S. over a 20-year period, 1993 to 2013. This amounted to roughly 8 trillion kilowatt-hours of energy. Both elements of the process, 1, the reduction of radioactive material and 2, the production of non-carbon energy, had significant environmental impact. They were expressions of a cooperative framework that positioned nuclear disarmament and just transitions to climate-compatible societies in very favorable terms. To answer the question, is there a contribution that cooperative nuclear disarmament has offered and could offer to just transitions to climate-compatible societies, it must be observed that the very presence of thousands of nuclear weapons and the management of the arsenals that are necessary for their maintenance and functionality have a tremendous negative impact both on the environment and on societies. Costs alone are in the order of a cumulative $387 billion spent to build and maintain nuclear arsenals over the past 5 years. The M2M program's success depended on cooperation across various domains, including government, the private sector, civil society, academia, and the international community. A proper assessment is still needed to integrate perspectives and evidence from each domain. Additionally, further analysis of M2M could help calculate the environmental impacts that may result from new weapons-to-energy conversion programs. Understanding the mechanisms that enable cooperation and collaboration. While much of the history of the megatons to megawatts case remains obscure, it is clear that while the program was operational, there were real, positive gains from the cooperation between adversaries, and that the benefits were realized in terms of both nuclear disarmament and a decarbonized portion of the US energy system. As the contemporary world grapples with questions of how to again reduce international confrontation, restore regional security, reduce global emissions to reverse current warming trends, and boost energy production, there are important lessons to be learned from this case. Whether or not denuclearization and nuclear energy will be effective strategies to achieve those goals, the mechanisms that enabled past success, namely, the institutions, structures, relationships, and policies that enabled adversaries to achieve mutual gains, may be the key to developing new strategies to address our current global challenges. In collaboration with the community of Sant'Egidio, well known for its peacemaking work, Columbia University's Advanced Consortium and Cooperation, Conflict and Complexity, AC4, established a cooperative nuclear disarmament and sustainability initiative, CNDSI, that focuses on actual cases of cooperative nuclear disarmament and their impact on sustainability through 4 lenses: political diplomatic dynamics, scientific and technical solutions, economic impact, environmental significance. While aware that the current trend is towards rearmament, the constructive engagement approach of the evaluation emphasizes that motivations towards nuclear disarmament can be strengthened by a deeper understanding of positive, previous experiences. The CNDSI work is based on open, non-classified sources that are becoming increasingly available, as well as interdisciplinary literature. By allowing the dismantling of thousands of Russian nuclear weapons, the M2M program has been a significant moment in the disarmament trajectory and demonstrated that disarmament is possible and can produce beneficial results. It invites the exploration of the reasonableness of nuclear disarmament, the relevance of mutually attractive strategies for actors involved, security, technical, economic, and environmental, and the contribution of technological advances and civilian use of nuclear energy. The worrying trend in rearmament comes at a moment in human history where our planet's life-sustaining climate system is increasingly compromised by rising global temperatures. There is an urgent need to rapidly decarbonize the global economy to limit global warming by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, GHGs. However, unless designed with justice and social vulnerability in mind, efforts in an energy transition may present disproportionate risks for already marginalized populations worldwide. After a decline in nuclear power as an energy source, the scientific community is once again examining its potential as a tool for decarbonization. In this context, the CNDSI's work explores whether there are environmental peacebuilding and decarbonization dividends that the Megatons to Megawatts program could impart. The interconnectivity and interdependence between the climate and security spheres necessitate a thorough examination of cooperative and collaborative actions that can facilitate constructive engagement. There is an inherent tension between the two, where cooperation enables independent action toward an overarching objective and requires coordination across independent parties, while collaboration acknowledges interdependencies and requires deep engagement and shared action toward a collective goal or set of goals. While recent trends in international relations are worrying, they are not necessarily path-dependent. The issues of disarmament, de-escalation, peacebuilding through non-proliferation, and climate action span local to global scales and must be pursued collaboratively. The lessons of historical cooperation are crucial and salient for the current geopolitical moment, as there is a good precedent for developing mutually beneficial approaches to enable nuclear disarmament. Authors: Andrea Bartoli is a senior research scholar at Columbia University's AC4, where he leads the Cooperative Nuclear Disarmament and Sustainability Initiative, CNDSI. Dr. Bartoli has also worked in peacemaking as the president of the Sant'Egidio Foundation for Peace and Dialogue, SFPD, an executive advisor of the Soka Institute for Global Solutions, SIGS. Joshua Fisher is the AC4's director and the principal investigator for its Environment, Peace, and Sustainability program. Dr. Fisher employs natural and social science methodologies to understand the nexus of environmental sustainability, natural resource governance, and social stability, working in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Asia-Pacific, and the United States. The views contained in this article are the author's alone and do not represent the views of Columbia University and the Sant'Egidio Foundation for Peace and Dialogue.
This was the Horizon Audiofiles, a podcast of the Defense Horizon Journal. For more information, go to www.tdhj.org. Thank you for listening.